credit here to a guy who is in California. His name is Craig Israelson. I'm not sure to what extent you encounter portfolio theory in CFA studies. So apologies if it's a lot. I'm not quite sure where to pitch for everybody. But portfolio theory is the basis around which you want to create a theory, a portfolio that will deliver certain returns. Classical portfolio theory basically talks about equities and bonds, typically in a 60% equity, 40% bond split. And the main lever in classical portfolio theory in terms of dealing with client risk is moving that switch between exposure to equities and exposure to bonds. Classical portfolio theory also said when you get near to retirement, you want to be nearly always in bonds because you need to be close to taking the cash. Okay. I used to agree with that too. It makes sense. But my thinking is moving on as the world moves on, as we understand a lot more. And Craig Israelson did his PhD in California, and he developed some modeling based on tracking asset performance backwards to, I think it was 1944. It probably says so on the slide, I forgot. And basically, if you look at equity performance in that period of time, equities globally have averaged something like 8.5% forever, including in counting for the big dips. So that number includes the 2008 dip, which is just about the biggest one everyone has seen since 1929. And I don't really want to talk about 1929 because I don't know it. But most of us remember 2008. And on a slide later, you'll see the extent of that dip. What Craig Israelson did was come up with a plan for us building portfolios. It says, look, you want to get your client from A to B. Now, I labour this point about getting from A to B. I'm not an investment broker. I'm not trying to get you 20% on something in the next 6 months. Okay? And I say that because my first experience of wealthy Russians, when I put together portfolios like this, was to lose the client to a broker down the road who put them into algo currency trading. And I said, you'll lose all your money. And 6 months later, I said, what happened? They said, you lost all his money. Okay. So this is for the long term. Craig Israelson did this work, and the 8.4% that you get from equity risk can be reproduced with a massive reduction in the magnitude and frequency of losses. What does that mean? It means you can get off the cycle, let's call it retire, spend the money at a far more controlled point in your life. You're not retiring on a down. The market is cyclical. We know that. We're not about to change it. But if you could get 8.5% returns over the duration of your plan without this huge amount of volatility, this is a good thing. And this is why I think it applies to somebody whether you're on $100 a month or you're starting with a $10 million portfolio. Okay? And basically, Craig's conclusion, and the research really is hugely thick. I can't begin to reproduce it today. But 7 core asset groups spread across about 12 funds will give you a return that mimics equities with the risk associated with bonds. Okay, and here are the asset groups. Basically, 4 equity groups, alternatives, bonds, and cash. Nothing rocket scientist-y about that. Let's look at those asset classes going backwards a bit. This line I particularly hate because I'm in a meeting at this point with a client who's got lots of property. And you show him something like this and he says, yeah, I'm right. Your answer is your property is where it is. Okay. So you can see that this is testing over a 43-year period. Okay. Line to focus on is the standard deviation line. So this is the measure of volatility, the crude measure of volatility in the portfolio. Okay. Actually, the return from bonds isn't as bad as I thought. The return from real estate is much higher than I thought when I first started to look at this. Okay. But what if you could get equity returns from this kind of standard deviation, this kind of risk? Okay. What does that mean in practice? Bonds losses. At the worst, bonds and cash have lost out. Okay. The fear in the client from investing that I referred to on the slide earlier comes because they all know about this. They all know how bad it can be. Every experienced Russian senior individual that I've sat in a room with says, if I do this, I can lose everything. Well, the answer is no. The demonstration of how to do it takes time and it takes getting to know them. But okay. To be diversified, portfolio is a bit like making a good salsa. You've got to have a number of ingredients that have low correlation with each other. Those asset classes I just referred to go up and down at different times, typically. Okay, let's look. Okay. This, where one is absolute correlation on a one-to-one basis, this is the correlation between those asset classes over the period from 1970 to 2012. Okay. So, why this portfolio structure works is because the aggregate average correlation between those asset classes is 0.2. That's how you can put together a portfolio for somebody that will deliver equity-type returns with bond-type risk. And this is something we at ABC Advisory say, to be successful in investing, in the investment part of getting from A to B, must plan to save quite a substantial amount. It feels something. 10 to 15% of your income. Rebalance the portfolios regularly. Rebalancing has a cost. Okay, there's a transaction cost with rebalancing. That's why we don't do it every month. Because the only income you've got to spend on this, in the mind of the client, is the portfolio's income. So transaction costs, if you rebalance the whole portfolio too often, will erode your income. And also, you'll see at the moment, actually, that more regular rebalancing doesn't perform any better. Each asset, because they're counter-cyclical, they don't correlate, each asset in that group is good one year and bad the next. Okay? Clients have to resist the temptation to stick it in last year's really good performing asset. And I'll show you why in a minute. Everybody does it. You want to be frustrated financial planner? Sit with people who say, I bought this thing did really well last year. Hold your breath. Right. Reasonable expectations. If your client wants 20% in 6 months, that's not a reasonable expectation. But there are plenty of people, and I talk about, going back to my ethics point of 20 minutes ago, there are people out there who are promising them 20% in 6 months. And in the jurisdictions that I've practiced in before, that's illegal and it's policed heavily. So for me, working in a jurisdiction where this regulation is perhaps not yet born, or it's going through pregnancy or whatever, that's been quite a challenge to work in. Performance measures in years, not weeks. And get your benchmarking correctly. If you benchmark everything against the S&P 500, well, where in your retirement goal, at any stage in the plan, did you say, I want to retire with 25 years performance of the S&P 500? You retire on the basis of, I want to buy a flat in, Algeria. I want to make sure all my kids are looked after. Get me there. Not. So your benchmarking has to be, go back to the plan. Quickly, a bit more about the insurance bond. Manx law is the Isle of Man. There are a number of British overseas territories that gave birth to financial services systems that are used throughout the world. Why? Because the British colonized a lot of islands who weren't big enough to have any other kind of industry. And London had a very well-developed insurance industry which it exported to these islands. The key feature that this begins with is its life assurance. Now, why? Because originally, life assurance was just the payment of a premium to secure an insurance outcome. Then people wanted to insure for a longer period, at which point premiums would be going up. Premiums in the last stages of life would be unaffordable. So people started putting investments within the life structure in order to balance the cost of the premiums over time. And gradually people woke up and therefore established the legal precedent that investments within a life insurance wrapper was normal and ordinary. And that out of that grew realization of the benefits, because the taxation of the assets within the life wrapper is based on the life assurance company's corporation tax rate. And in some of these jurisdictions, that's 0. But it's a taxable operation. So why is it beneficial to our clients? Because, therefore, assets grow free of tax, and that tax saving is reinvested annually and compounded annually. And in the jurisdiction in which they're resident, they can report the tax has been dealt with in this asset quite happily. The range of assets you can therefore hold is practically unlimited, with the specific limitation there were private trading companies in which the directors don't relinquish control. Because the thing that makes this work is that ownership and control are divested from the client. You get tax-free roll-up of income and gains. In Russia, this is not a controlled foreign company. We've looked at that at quite some length in terms of establishing with legal advisors here and also in the UK from an insurance law perspective. And also insurance structures are exempt from currency control legislation explicitly in Russia, which means that when it comes to, there are complicated rules about the return of proceeds of sales of securities to bank accounts situated in Russia. Okay. An attraction to clients here is that proceeds of insurance structures are exempt from that legislation. That's enough for now.